The purpose of this presentation is to argue that Spinoza's ontology is best understood as process ontology and not as substance ontology. I will be using the main argument from Professor Francesca de Papa's paper, Spinoza and Process Ontology. First, we begin with Descartes and the causal containment principle. The causal containment principle is as such. The cause must contain as much reality as its effect. If it were not true, then a thing does not have to have the reality as the thing that causes it. This is akin to saying stuff can come from nothing. Descartes uses this to argue that his idea of God proves that God must exist. His idea couldn't be if there was not some correspondent existing thing out there. In traditional creationism, God must contain everything he creates. If God did not contain everything he created, then some things exist apart from God. But everything depends upon God to persist in its being, so it's impossible for things to persist from God. At the same time, God is absolutely different from creation. He's complete and whole versus creation, which is temporal and composed of parts. So in some way, God must also contain imperfection. But what sense does God contain imperfection? This is where the idea of the immanent containment principle comes into play. Immanent meaning higher form. The cause of something contains at least everything that the effect contains. For example, the cause doesn't look like the effect, but possesses the power or virtue of the effect in a higher form. An architect doesn't look like a house, but the reality of the house exists immanently in the architect's mind and skill. So God contains imperfection in the sense that imperfection is a derivative feature of lesser forms derived from God's perfection. First, we must pay a visit to Aristotle, who established the distinction between actuality and potentiality. Actuality is the perfection of a thing's essence. Someone only becomes a person through the activity of being rational, or an acorn has the potential to become a tree. For God, there was no potentiality because he is perfect. He is his essence, which is pure thought. So then God is pure actuality. The question then is posed for Jewish and Christian philosophers on how God, who is perfect, causes an imperfect world. How do you combine God's perfection with the notion that he has a free will, or that he can choose to be something other than his perfect nature? The idea of free will affects the relationship between a thing's essence and its activity. If something acts only in accordance with its nature, it doesn't have free will. So then a doctrine emerged called concurrens Dei, that God acts alongside the actions of man and nature, and this preserves the idea of freedom. Substance ontology posits an underlying substratum of everything that is actually real. For metaphysics, this is what substance is, the tofu of existence where properties are the contingent flavoring. When it comes to notions of personal identity, this is what the self is. Substance ontology is the cosmic subject predicate, and it seems very tough to get away from because it's how our language works. Extremely briefly, process ontology here needs to be described as an ontology where activity is the most helpful way to describe being. As it relates to Spinoza, we should expect to describe substance in terms of what it does rather than what it is. This is what de Papa targets for this paper, is the relation between a subject and its essence. To explain why Spinoza's ontology is process, we need to begin with the basic concepts and work our way forward. Substance is that which contains all. Substance makes itself exist. Modes are what are contained in substance. Modes are caused by something else. There exists, then, only substance and modes. Proposition 30 says that the intellect perceives only attributes and modes. A true thought must correspond to something out of their nature. Quote, what is contained objectively in the intellect must necessarily be in nature. There is only substance and modes following from this, so the intellect must only conceive of substance and its modes. Here's the twist that makes us think differently about substance. Spinoza does not argue that substance is what is conceived by the intellect, instead its affections. He concludes the demonstration of Proposition 30 by saying, therefore, an actual intellect must comprehend God's attributes and God's affections, and nothing else. The attributes and modes of substance must then be the corresponding real thing out there in nature that the intellect conceives. But now where is substance? Where is its place in relation to attributes? As de Papa argues, substance and attributes are identified as being two sides of the same coin, but we can only understand what this means by understanding how power and essence are the same thing. God's substance is total power. God's substance, again, must cause itself. If it didn't, then it's not God's substance. God's substance must be unrestrained, otherwise it couldn't be. If nothing stops a thing from being, then it will be. God's substance's essence is existence. Without existence, there is no God substance. Power is the extent to which a thing affects the world around it. Fire burns, animals stalk prey, humans reason. These attributes are how things affect the world. One important thing to notice about this is these are just things that these entities do. They can't help but do them. Spinoza's idea of the mind as an effect of various processes is a consequence of this notion. So then, it follows that God's substance is total power. Essence, existence, and power are then the same thing. What follows from all of this is that God does not have properties. If a thing's essence and a thing's power are one, then the essence of a thing is how it'll act in the world. In other words, and simply put, a thing will act according to its nature. God's substance is total power, and its essence is existence. Therefore, God will act according to its nature of total power and essence, which is existence. The notion of property of substance is the idea that substance can be something separate from its features. Rephrased, properties are contingent features not necessary to substance. This contradicts with the conclusion that God's substance will act according to its nature. Therefore, God's substance cannot have properties. God's attributes are activities. Spinoza's ontology is best understood as process. God's substance's attributes are better interpreted as activities, which are expressive of the nature of God's substance. There was not power prior to the affections, but how a thing acts is the power. De Papa says, quote, God's essence or power is always power of, end quote. Power is not something that is detached from a thing. Cause and effect are both a part of the same process, and it is not true to nature to suppose that one can be detached from the other. This understanding of God's substance aligns with our understanding of process ontology, in which there is no subject prior to activity. A subject exists only because of the processes that produce it, rather than the other way around.